Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this meeting of the Macroom Historical Society. In the first instance, we have to apologise for the cancellation of the last meeting. Unfortunately, our speaker became ill and just couldn't turn up, but we're very hopeful we'll get her back again in the autumn. So that's something to look forward to, because she was going to speak about Eastern European politics and the development of what happened there. But for tonight, we have James O'Callaghan, who's going to give us a talk on Macroom shopfronts from an architectural perspective. Now, I have been asked to remark that James comes from, how would you say, an eminent Macroom family, his forebearers being his uncle and his father being very well-known Macroom footballers in their day, being Timmy O'Callaghan and Jimmy O'Callaghan, his father. So having got that part out of the way, I'll now go on to James himself, who also has a very eminent pedigree, because having started building shopfronts, he went on to get into the completely academic world of it. He has a master's in building conservation, specialising in shopfronts, and he has been lecturing on the subject for several years at MTU. So I'm sure there's everything to look forward to this evening. That's all I've got to say now. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. First of all, can you all hear me okay? Yeah. I think my voice does travel a little bit anyway. Yes, thanks very much for coming out this evening. It's a good crowd. I wasn't expecting as big a crowd, to be honest with you, but I'm delighted to see it. Just to talk a little bit about myself and why I'm talking about this subject. As Margaret said, I've been teaching in the area of architecture and architectural technology for too long now, almost 25 years in MTU. And about 10 years ago, I decided to do a master's because I had a big interest in building conservation. So I did a master's. It was a distance learning master's with in University in Edinburgh, Heriot Watt University. And it was a fabulous experience and I really enjoyed it. But the dissertation at the end of it took all my attention, really, and I struggled to think of a good subject to do in my dissertation. Now, since I was 16, I was a carpenter when I started serving my time as a carpenter when I was 16, and I worked in a couple of different workshops, one of them down in Clonakilty for about 3 years. We built a lot of shop fronts down there, and so I had this background in building shop fronts and off-standard joinery and so on. I went on then as an architectural technologist and started doing the drawings for these, all the while kind of drawing on my experience. And then when I started teaching in MTU, I actually started teaching the carpenter joiners. And I struggled for a while to help them to understand the principles of scale and proportion, because it's a very geometrical based trade. I struggled with trying to get them to understand scale and proportion as something being an actual topic. So when I was doing the master's, I decided to put all of these little elements together: shop fronts, scale and proportion, and teaching. And I came up with a dissertation that concentrated on using the traditional shop front as a tool to deliver a class on scale and proportion. And when I got all of this coming together, I ended up doing a lot of research on old shop fronts. Now, at the time that I was doing it, I was looking for good examples of shop fronts and bad examples of shop fronts. I had no problem finding bad examples, I can tell you that straight off. I went into Mahon Point and I had rows and rows of bad examples of shop fronts, and I had no problem with that. But I had a bit of a problem finding good examples. And it's only after revisiting this for this talk that I realized that it was right on my doorstep. We have a fabulous record of old shop fronts in this town. And I think it's not a subject for everybody to be interested in, but I do think that it would help us if we stopped and had a look every once in a while, again, just to renew our interest in it, because it is a part of the identity of our town. And I hope that when I finish this talk, I will have shown you how it actually relates back to very good architecture, very good design, and it's all here in our little town. How it got here, I don't know, but maybe we might be able to trace that. So that's basically the tenet of the talk. My front slide here is showing a picture from the Lawrence collection there of the North Square. You can see the McGregor's and the old bank building and so on, and a couple of shop fronts along there. And above it, you've got the orders of classical architecture. So I'm going to introduce a link between those two that isn't always recognised, and it's good as well to appreciate it. I suppose at the end you can ask any questions you like, but I'm kind of okay if you want me to stop and answer any question as well as I go. I'm okay with that too. So where does the street or the shop front really come from? From my research, I went back far as I could, and I stopped at Pompeii. Now, I visited Pompeii a good number of years ago, and I was fascinated by it. But this picture here really sums it up. It was a snapshot in time that showed us a typical street in a Roman town, a Roman city. This particular Roman city, of course, is a very wealthy city because it was surrounded with very good fertile land, and there was a lot of wine being grown in the region. And it was international because they were exporting an awful lot of that wine. Now, the ironic thing about that is it was fertile land because there was a lot of volcanic ash there. And that's ultimately it was the demise of the city, was the volcanic ash as well. But it played a big part in their lives because you can see all their footpaths, roadways, buildings. They used the lime to mix mortar to join the stonework together. They rendered the buildings with lime, and they used concrete footpaths and all of that. And they all had a mixture of volcanic ash in them. It's what they call the pozzolan, and it was for hardening their lime mix, because generally lime mix is relatively soft. So you have to have these additives in it to do different things. For their footpaths and so on, they mixed the volcanic ash in it. But it made it very, very long lasting. Now, you can see this street here. It's a typical street in Pompeii. It leads up towards the Forum or the central square. And you can see the development of streets or street frontages on each side. But the most interesting is the footpath and what we would consider to be a zebra crossing. These guys here. Now, the idea of that is, of course, they get torrential rain there, and it all flows onto the road and runs down into their drainage system. And so, the very well-to-do won't get their robes wet when they walk across the streets. Also, there's a lot of horse manure on the street, and they don't want to be actually stepping on that part. Now, if you think about it, and believe it or not, it was mentioned to me by one of my supervisors at the time, the Romans had a problem with boy racers, and they had their young lads that had get enough money together for a chariot, and they come into the towns and they were causing a bit of a trouble. So they adopted a traffic management system, and so they left these little gaps in between the stones, so the wheels of the carriage would go through it, and the horse, if there's two horses to go on one side of it, if there's one horse, he'd have to step over it. But you can see that the little troughs are cut into the stonework as a result of that. All of those along there are the old the marks that the carriages made. Now, regardless of what it was like, it must have been a bumping ride. So the idea was to slow down the traffic. Now, interestingly, we could learn something from Pompeii, but that was the idea. Slow down the traffic as much as possible. If you're going to come into our city, you're going to go very, very slowly. And it must be on good business because it's not going to be an easy ride. And of course, they were taking deliveries all the time. So, you know, they were going through there. But they had a road network outside of Pompeii that was taking the wine out of the area, a bit like our bypass. You know, so you can relate a lot of Pompeii to Macroom. Now, again, the curbing very carefully laid out and the footpaths on each side. So movement across ways was very, very easy. It was pedestrian priority. That's the thing about Pompeii, pedestrian priority. And as a result of that, we had the forming of shop frontages all the ways along. Obviously, with a shop trying to sell your wares, so you try to attract people to your shop over the person next to you or the person down beyond you again. And the best way to do that was to make your shop as attractive as possible. I do have a reference in the next slide onwards about how they actually, you know, decorated their shop fronts. They used leaves and paintings and bright colours and stuff like that. So ultimately, it was the essence of a shop front as we would know it was forming on the streets. And they were all quite individual. So I can imagine what Pompeii must have been like in its heyday, a very, very colourful place. That's where I started from. In actual fact, the architecture goes way, way back beyond that again. Now, the Romans really had perfected the classical architecture style, but they had adopted it from all other styles. And they adopted it mostly from the Greeks, but the Greeks adopted it from unusual versions of what was being built in the Nile Valley at the time. And they were built out of timber and reed and so on. And the first column here is the Greek Doric column style. That to me is the most natural one. All the others came later and they were all formed from a very organic shape. But if you look at this particular column here, and again, if you just keep in the back of your mind how this relates to a shop front, this is like a vertical column, and columns are appearing as some form in shop fronts all over the place. So this to me is the most natural one because it's bowing out. If you notice, it's curving. It's narrower at the top than it is in the bottom. And the reason it's doing that is because the Greeks believed that if to achieve full aesthetics or the most pleasing view to the human eye, you reach to nature and you look to see the forms in nature. And if you can achieve that, you're achieving aesthetics. And they weren't wrong, because that particular column there was originally formed using reeds. So the Egyptians actually used reeds in vertical columns. They strapped them together very tightly and they put timber beams down on top of them. And the weight of the timber beam and the building above it, as it came down, it forced it to bulge out a little bit in the middle. And it was an optical illusion that the Greeks adopted because they built in stone. They didn't have this problem. They could have built straight and it wouldn't have bowed out. But they wanted to continue to use the optical image or impression of a natural shape. And they felt that with a heavy element on top of those columns, pressing down on it and forcing it out in the middle, it looked natural. And it does. The best example of that is in the Greek temples. And there's barely a straight line in a Greek temple. You know, most of the Greek temples have contours and twists and turns. When you look at a line straight on, it's actually cambering upwards in case it gives the impression that it's cambering downwards. They counteracted the visual element all the time. As it progressed onwards, or should I have a pointer here? Thanks to Pat Sheehy for the pointer that he gave me just a minute ago. The scroll here is, again, it's a very, very naturally occurring shape in nature, but you can imagine that if that was the top of a reed or something less solid, more organic, like a timber column, and you put weight down on top of it, it would start to curl out at the edges. It would start to push out at the edges. And that's why that spiral was formed. It's referred some places as a monkey's tail or a scroll. And again, it has its basis in the natural world. You could see this shape in nature in lots of places. These are more decorative. Again, the Corinthian and the composite are more like Roman versions of it. And the Romans like to decorate. They like to use leaves and flowers and stuff like that to decorate. And they decided to do this in the tops of their columns as well. But again, narrow at the center, the middle, and tapering outwards as if it was taking a natural shape. These have been very well documented and measured over centuries by any architectural student who's been very eager to measure all of these. The reasons these work, and we don't know it immediately, but the reason they work is because of their scale and proportion to the natural world. It looks right to us. It looks pleasing and it's aesthetic. If we can adopt that scale, our designs can be, very successful. The best architects and the best designers adopt the proportions of that style to other elements in their buildings, and they're usually quite successful in it. What it leads to is this little thing here. It's called the golden ratio. Now it's called many, many things. I like to call it the golden ratio because for me it's to do with ratio. There's also the golden rectangle or golden triangle or the golden, a whole variety of things. But I call it the golden ratio. I stick with the golden ratio because it is based on a ratio. And it seems to be something in around 3:5. So if you have an element that is a window that is 3 feet wide, should be about 5 feet tall. If you have an element that's 5 feet wide, it should be maybe 8 feet tall. And that's the principle of it. That proportion seems to satisfy us. And it doesn't really matter if it's turned sideways or vertical. It's just a proportion that you're seeing in nature. It appears in nature an awful lot. That scroll is a very natural shape. You can see Leonardo da Vinci applied it to some of his finest work. In fact, it's very hard pressed to find any of Da Vinci's work that doesn't have the golden ratio in it. It's somewhere appearing there all the time. Now, as we progress through this, I want you to try and keep that in mind because it appears in our shop fronts. It appears everywhere in our shop fronts. I wonder if it's an intentional thing. I suspect it is, but anyway. So that's the basis of it. So if you're getting this proportion correct, you're quite likely going to create something of beauty. And beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but it's also, if it's aesthetic to us, if it's pleasing to us, it's beautiful. So I jumped ahead a bit. I cut out about 800 years of history, maybe more, and jumped ahead to the 18th century and see the forming of the very early classical traditional shop front. Now, they're all over the UK. I did my, like I said, I did my master's in Edinburgh, and I based a lot of that on the old shop fronts in Edinburgh, which are very unusual because they're bow fronted. They come out in a bow like that. And in the old town of Edinburgh, it slopes up to the castle, so you have basements a lot in these shops. So you have steps going up to the actual shop, but there's steps going down to the basement, and you got the full bow front going all the ways down. They're very unusual, but they have the same thing in common. They have the golden ratio. It appears an awful lot simply because of the cost of glass at the time. These panes of glass are all hand-floated glass. It's very expensive at any stage to create glass. Glass melts or you melt sand at about 1700 degrees Celsius to make glass. So you need an awful lot of energy to create glass. And obviously the large plate glass wasn't available. The technology just wasn't there to create that. So you ended up really having smaller panes, but they're referred to as hand floated because they are heated and poured out onto a plate or onto a tray, and it's floated by hand to get it nice and smooth and thin. And that results in a kind of a ripple. So any of the old buildings you see with the rippling glass, it's very unusual and it's very rare, and it should be maintained. And they can be very easily maintained. They can be adapted for modern technology, but those particular panes of glass are very, very unusual. But they result in this kind of an unusual ripple across. So you're getting a distorted view when you look through it. They also used a type of cylinder or a blown glass where they blew it into a cylinder shape. Then when it was drying, they'd cut it until it would fall out into a flat shape. But it had all of these very unusual elements in them. So it made the glass very interesting, but you couldn't make it big. You couldn't get a big pane of glass, resulting in these shapes. But again, always adopting the golden proportion. Even in the panes of glass, in the glass size for the door, even in the panels of the doors, kept on adopting that proportion. It was appearing everywhere. Now, I've put this next to a simple sketch of a temple, and you can see the similarities, what's been adopted by the designers carrying across the classical style. That's a quote there from Bunford, who wrote a lot about classical architecture, and he claimed to have this description of what a shopfront would have been like back in Pompeii. A brightly painted exterior attracts the likely customer. Bright colours attracting the likely customer, which is a very, very good point, and we'll see this later in my slides. Colour is everything and is very important. Fresh leaves adorning the lentils, so you're adopting the Corinthian style of the orders, and decorating your shop front. Implements of the trade are displayed in steps and stones. And while above the balcony, some work of some luckless picture painter implores the purchaser. That's basically a signage. And again, it moves into where we find a lot of our signs written over the doors in the naturally occurring fascia, or frieze in this case, that appears in our shop fronts based on the classical architecture. Once again, I highlight their scale and proportion. That's what's appearing through it all the time. This is the same theme that's running through it all the time. This always happens to me. I'm halfway through my research and I get taken right back again, and back further, way further back than I expected, because like I say, all of those the classical orders were all based on natural shapes and buildings that had gone before, using more organic materials that were suffering from the weight above them and so on. This is straight out of Athens, the entrance gate to the Acropolis, the hill of the Acropolis. Again, very simple Doric style, but you notice that there's these little indentations in the stonework. That's a reference to a timber structure that would have been there before it. And they're the lead bolts that are used to hold on the tile work above it. And because the Greeks felt that this was natural, it was a natural effect, they introduced it in the stonework, even though it has no relevance. It's not necessary in the stonework, but they introduced it anyway, because they felt that it was important that people, when they looked at the building, they could understand its makeup, even though it's made of marble and very, very unlikely to fall over without bolts in it. They still maintained that. These vertical elements in the frieze here are referring to the ends of the rafters of a roof. So they carried on all of these elements that were there for a purpose in one building, but they carried it through in the architecture of the next building. Even though it was not necessary in the next building, they carried it through anyway. Again, I suppose I'm kind of highlighting here what are the themes running through it. The plinth, invariably there's a plinth at the bottom of an 18th century or 19th century shop front. A pilaster. Now the pilaster is basically a fake column. It's the element that runs up from ground up to the underside of the frieze. And it's representing the actual column. So from an impression point of view, when you look at it, you feel that's taking the weight. And narrowing that substantially can have a visual effect on you. So quite often with the 19th century shop fronts, if the shop front is big, the pilaster is big and wide. If the shop front is smaller, the pilaster gets much narrower. I will say about the fluting that's caused in there, that engraving there that's in every one of those columns, there's a purpose for that. Again, like I say, it was based on reeds that were strapped together. So the reeds were, you had this bumpy surface on the columns. And so they decided to repeat that. The Greeks repeated it in an awful lot of their buildings. The Romans, not so much. They stopped doing it later on. But the Greeks were very keen on it. And the reason they did it is because, again, it was a natural shape. And when the sun hit it, as the sun would set, you get this different impression on every column. And it's part of the optical illusion of strength. It gives it an awful lot of strength. It looks natural. And so they adopted it in every one of their buildings, even though, again, it's purely for decorative purposes. It wasn't doing anything. And you find that appearing in an awful lot of shop fronts. The fluted plaster. So the plasters will have that fluting on it. Not in Macroom. It happens nowhere in Macroom shop fronts. The later ones, yes, but they're out of place. The traditional Macroom shop front does not have a fluted plaster. It's something slightly different, and I'll show you that in a minute. So you get the plinth, the plaster, the capital, just the top there, the cornice. The cornice, you'll see, is something that's identifiable. The craftspeople who put these shop fronts together over the years used opportunities to make themselves unique, to stand out, that you could recognize their work. They had a couple of options in it, and quite often that cornice was something that they adopted as being individual. So you will find different versions of that in different shop fronts, and in some cases they relate directly to the craftspeople involved. They use other opportunities as well. It's not shown on this shop front, but a bracket is very common in Irish shop fronts, and the bracket, again, was an opportunity for craftspeople to do something unique or individual, and you see it a lot in Macroom shop fronts. I'll draw your attention again, this is 19th century, I'll draw your attention again to the golden ratio, the scale and proportion. You can see it appearing as a shape in a lot of the elements of the shop front, which makes it just that bit more appealing to us. We don't know why, but it does. We're not aware of it all the time. We're not looking at something and said, God, that looks lovely. It must have great scale and proportion. That's not coming to mind at all. It's just there as a natural element that is pleasing to the eye. And if we can make it pleasing to the eye, maybe we might be able to sell the stuff that's inside in the shop. Finn's Quay came to mind eventually in my studies. Now, Finn's Quay, if I can describe where Finn's Quay is to you, I'm sure most of you know where it is. Cork City, as you're travelling down the Mardyke, and you come up to those traffic lights that are behind the courthouse. There's a row of buildings, that's it there. No, that's not the best photograph. I should reconsider that one. But anyway, those buildings, they're standing there. And I suppose quite often you'd just drive past them, but I was drawn to them because of a conservation project that was carried out in them in 1995. Now, they were bought by a developer in 1983 or 84, and he they put in a planning application to knock them and build offices there, because there's a need for a lot of the legal profession have a need for a lot of the offices around there because of the location to the courthouse. So they put in an application to knock them. But in a little bit of research by Cork County Council, and in particular the Heritage Department, they kind of discovered that these are actually very, very old buildings. Not sure should we be knocking them. So when they went to research them a little bit more, they realised they're actually the oldest existing residential buildings in Cork City. They fall within the walls of the old town. Most of that part of the city was renewed, but they weren't. Those buildings were remaining. Now it's called Finn's Quay for a reason, because it was a quay when they were built. They were built in around the 1750s, which is quite a long time ago. Cork City was a very, very different place in the 1750s. There was a lot of boats coming up to the streets within the city, because it was all quays, all filled in later on. And as they went outside of the wall of the city, when they went outside the walls of the city, they ended up in places like Patrick Street, which is why it's shaped in a funny way, because it followed the line of the rivers. And an awful lot of them got filled in for streets. But at the time that these buildings were built, they were built on a quay. Now, interestingly, they were built as residential buildings, and they were not intended to be shops on the ground floor. The shops came along afterwards. They were 19th century. And that's important for these buildings, because these buildings are the early Georgian style. You can see, again, what's appearing with these is an awful lot of the scale and proportion that is adopted through classical architecture is adopted in these buildings. Even the front elevation of each individual building is following that golden ratio. The ratio of the height of the roof in relation to the building is the golden ratio. And that's why it is appealing. I don't think there's anybody who would say that a Georgian building doesn't look good. It does look good. It is a beautiful building. It is beautiful architecture. And it's solely and entirely down to that proportion. But you can see that the shop fronts down at the bottom here don't really fit. They don't seem to fit that comfortably on it, because they're a later addition. And that's something that we have to remember, something very important. I'll just flick back if I can. That's the Lawrence collection. That's the street. That photograph was taken 120 years ago, 130 years ago or more. But the shop fronts have been changing. And that's the thing about a street. It changes all the time. It's constantly changing. How much we want to keep of the traditional is up to ourselves, but we have to realize that it's a very organic thing. A street is a very organic thing. Shops come and go. The use of the shops come and go and so on. But, so what we see as a street frontage isn't necessarily the way it was designed in the first place, They're adaptations. And that's what makes Finn's Quay interesting to me. And I did a lot of work on the conservation of this building and the documenting of this building. Those shop fronts are much later addition. And it's not very clear from this picture, but you can see slates on over some of them. They're protruding outwards from the face of the building. Because they just wanted to grab a little bit more space for the shop. So they pushed out the shop front, and one or two of them had a roof on it, but mostly they had just lead lining and some flat roof elements going across them. And it was notorious for letting the water in. So the rain would run down the face of that building and find some little way into the back of that. If you go to Mallow, they pride themselves on the fact that their shop fronts are unique in that they protrude out from the building. So if you go up the main street in Mallow, you'll see that an awful lot of shop fronts are protruding outwards. They don't tell you the difficulty they have in keeping the rain out, because it's a very, very difficult detail. It's not impossible, but it's a very difficult detail, and it's the first place that it starts to break down, where you get neglect. When these buildings were scheduled for renovation, the neglect of that area was crucial. You know, all of that had to be replaced, and there was an awful lot of work went into it. That only happens, as far as I can see, in 3 places here in Macroom. The hole in the wall across the street has a protruding shop front. The shop next to it, the Drapers, has a protruding shop front. And interestingly, right on the corner, Killian Lynch's shop front is protruding outwards as well. Now, hopefully, it's detailed correctly that it won't let the rain in, but it only appears 2 or 3 times in Macroom, from what I can see. It's not something I'd recommend. In fact, the one thing that I've noticed about our traditional shop fronts, the ones that have lasted the longest are the ones that are not protruding out. They're more flush with the surface, or with the front elevation. So yeah, I'll just conservation project of 1995. The scale and proportion of the Georgian period carefully considered and applied with great effect to these buildings. These are always worth looking at because they're renovated now for quite a while. There's apartments in all of these, and the shops are operating away. There was a nice coffee shop at the end there. It was a very impressive place. It's a lovely coffee shop. I think it's closed now, but it's definitely worth a look. If you can get into one of these buildings, it's definitely worth a look because it was a very good conservation project. I got sort of slipped to one side in my research for this talk. Sorry, now I hope I'm not going on too long. In my research for this talk, I got sidelined a little bit by Frankie Toomey. I called in there on a request that he had a photograph or 2 for me, or an image or 2, and I started talking to him. Now, what he produced for me is, and this leads to my point about the development of a street, that it's not a set thing, it's changing all the time, it's an organic thing that's moving on all the time. This is Frankie Toomey's in the 1960s. It's all decked out for Corpus Christi. It's in looking its finest. That's when it was tea rooms, and the Toomeys were living in there. So they're living over the shop. That's day before yesterday. Or maybe not. No, actually, that might be from what I call the Kevin O'Brien collection, who's with us tonight. He gave me an awful lot of old photographs that he had. So that's one of his, I think. But this one here is a sketch done by a man called George Victor de Noyer, who was a surveyor. He called himself an artist, but he was a surveyor, and his day job was a surveyor with the Ardenne Survey Office. So he was around about Macroom in December of 1852, and that's Frankie Toomey's building that's standing there. Now, that's standing there, it looks an awful lot like a farm building. You've got hay and stuff outside it. You've got access and vent windows and stuff like that. It's not a house, but it is the original building. Now, the good thing about George Victor is that everywhere he went to survey for the Ardenne Survey of Ireland, which was doing it in around about the time of the famine or just after it, they must have been stepping over the bodies to measure stuff up in the hills and valleys and mountains. Now, they started surveying in around about 1832, but this was the 1850s was when they really tied down a very, very accurate mapping of Ireland, because they were cutting their teeth on good surveying for the Ardenne Survey Office in Ireland, and then they adopted it to the rest of the empire, as far as I know. But they did their test case in Ireland, and it was around about this time. But as where he went, he sketched as well. So there's a very important record of the physical environment. We got 1852, 100 years later, or a bit more, maybe 110 years later, and another 50 years on. You can see the development of something. It's moving all the time. It's changing all the time, you know. Farm building to tea rooms to hardware. The architecture of the classical architecture is there. You can see it in it. Got the golden proportions in there. We've got the special fan light over the doors in the golden proportions. You know, the nameplate or the fascia is following the classical architecture. It's appearing there in Frankie Toomey's as an example. That's just an example. It's appearing all over the place. It's appearing all over the town in all of the shop fronts. But it's just an example of a development from, 160, 170 years ago to today. That's how it does develop. Definitely going on a bit now, so I'm going to make this really quick. This element here, these drawings here are taken from the Dublin Docklands Authority came out with this document to help the Dublin Docklands to create shop fronts that made sense with their buildings, because they were having these big, huge plate windows and long plastic signs, and they were appalling. They didn't look anything like they belonged in the building, so they gave them guidelines. And the particular guidelines that struck me is to do with symmetry and asymmetry. You have a symmetrical building and then you have an asymmetrical building that is not balanced. How do you work your shop front into that? And it refers back again to the column, the lines of the columns. And it helps people. If you saw that shop in that street, you would look at that shop entrance and you'd say, not sure I want to go into that shop, because it doesn't look right. It doesn't look like it's held up very well. And that's our natural brain telling us, that's a big beam in there. No, I'm not sure that I want to go into that. We mightn't be able to tell it to ourselves, but we'll feel it. We'll know it. We'll feel uncomfortable about it. So the location of all of these columns, even though they're not holding up anything, they're elements of the shop front. The location of them is very important. The best example I could find of that is Murphy's Jewelers here. Again, a photograph I took only the other day. And these shop fronts have changed a lot. They've done a lot of changes. Not here tonight, I think, but been a lot of changes. I think they've settled on a very, very good one there. But you can see the strength that is in the location of these columns. They're not columns. That's not holding up any weight. This is, but that's not. They're not holding up any weight. But looking at the elevation of the building, you're satisfied that it's the correct proportion. And you feel safe about going in there. If they were very, very light, narrow posts, which is quite possible, you don't quite feel the same way. All to do with the scale and proportion. That's the asymmetry. The existing traditional, I decided to concentrate a little bit on this just to draw attention to it. What I could find of existing old shop fronts, there's a whole bunch of them, and some of them I couldn't feature here. But the ones that caught my eye, this is an old photograph of Connie Callahan's. It's completely renewed. Now, for some conservationists, they'd say that's terrible crime. You're after completely taking away what was old and putting in something brand new and pretending that it's old. To me, no crime committed at all. It's guaranteed another 100, 120 years. It wasn't going to last forever. It wasn't showing a huge amount of decay signs, to be fair, but it wasn't going to last forever. So he chose to renew it exactly as it was, and that's to his credit. I'll draw your attention to the bright colour of the red. That's something that's important, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute, but it is something that's very important, the colour. T.C. Murray's is, obviously, there's a lot of investment by the individual who owns that house. Put up scaffolding and they painted that building. It's a big undertaking, but it's well worth it, because the simpleness of the shop front, it's not wood, it's actually plaster formed. But the line, the door under the windows, the vertical glazing bars. Now the glazing bars, I should say, they're quite often individualized by the craftspeople as well. So to help identify who was involved in the building, it's like a signature. It's signature glazing bars. They could get very, very light when the quality of the glass got better, but you see the simplicity of it. It's fantastic, and it leaves space up there for the use of more sign writing and so on. They're using the whole building, and it's all tying together, and it all looks beautiful. It's very hard to appreciate that building. You have to stand on the other side of the road to really appreciate it. Evelyn's shop, again, very decorative, something that's not seen very often. We always call them dentils, but they refer back to our Greek architecture again. They were a naturally occurring element, the ends of the joists and the ends of the rafters in the roof. That's where these things came from, and they were copied as a decorative element. There's only a couple of shop fronts around Macroom that have them, but they are referred to as dentils because they look like teeth, I presume. But again, another identifying feature, and it's at the cornice point there where it's almost like a signature element. This is a very, very old shop front. It is showing signs of decay at the bottom, but nothing that can't be repaired, So it's flush with the wall as well. So it tends to behave better over time, the closer back to the wall it is. Art on Main Street, like this is 1 in a million. That's 1 in a million. And what makes it unusual, where we have fluted plasters all over the place, here we have mirrors in our plaster, and that's fantastic. That is fabulous. Even the railing is important. Up on top of that shop front there's a canopy. It hasn't been pulled out in years and years and years. When the signwriter was painting it, he said, I'm not going to go near it either, afraid to go near it really. It hasn't been pulled out in years and years simply because if they pulled out that canopy and a truck came along there to take it off down the street with it. And that's the problem with it. Now that presents us with an opportunity because now we've bypassed. There's very few of these trucks, if any, passing through. And this presents us with a new opportunity. This is Mrs. McSweeney's shop. It was a sweet shop, very popular sweet shop. The simplicity of the shop front is fantastic, but I'm drawing your attention here in particular to the asymmetry that's going on. The door doesn't line up with anything above it. The windows line up and so on, but the shop front itself stands on its own. And again, the simple nature of the colour. You've got a light green and a dark green. It's not serving its purpose as a shop anymore, though Patchy tells me it's exactly the same as the shop on the inside at the moment. I haven't been in there. I might convince her to let me in sometime. And these, you pass that. Younger generations would pass that all the time and not take much notice. But there it is. And it's a historical record. The colour, I just simply said colour is infectious. Now, the town has always been colourful. I suspect, I'm not a shop owner, some of you are, I suspect that we didn't get involved much with colour because of the amount of traffic that was passing through the town. The place got dirty very, very quickly. So we opted for the darker colours and stuff like that in our shop fronts. That's changed now. One thing's for sure, that's never been uncolourful. Humphrey Lynch's has always been a very colourful shop front. Where it lacks an actual shop front in the traditional style, makes up for in colour and sign writing. A beautiful frontage. And again, the proportions, the window proportions and all of that, that's what makes it appealing to us. But colour is infectious. And it's always been there. That street there is, we take it for granted now, but it is there and it is fabulous. It is a beautiful part of the town. Even Fitz's there has always been very, very colourful. What drew it out in me is Pickled. They came along and they did that, and I thought, God, that's fantastic. It's like Kinsale. Why can't we be like Kinsale? And then I started thinking, but actually, I don't want to be like Kinsale. I would be like Macroom. There you go. They brought it out in it, and it's infectious because Enchanted Flowers followed suit not long after. And you'll see that all the way down the street, up and down the street. And it's beautiful to see it. And the more colour, the better. And I do think that the council could step in here and give us a palette that we could work from, but at the same time, it should be dictated by the people in the town. We don't want to be limited to a palette either. The brighter colour, the better. It's now for the experimentation. Very recently, only 2 weeks ago, I was talking to a woman from Iries. And Iries now seems to be identifiable by the colour of the houses, And she said, just 12 or 13 years ago, somebody painted their house very colourful, and the next door neighbour said, geez, I might do something to contrast with that. And it just carried on through. And it's almost like their identity now. It's like it's always been there. And it wasn't. But that's how colour can be infectious. and it does brighten your day. When you look at it like that, you know, in a montage like that, it does kind of brighten your day. It is a very bright looking town when you think about it. Again, if I could go through every individual one of them and show you where these proportions are appearing. The brackets I didn't get a chance to talk about, but again, all of them, they're all very identifiable and they're all very unique in their own right.
Sorry, where's the middle one here on your left?
This one?
Yeah.
That's the Barbers right across from the post office.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
That's Murphy's, and that's Maura McCarthy's. Yeah. So, and again, you know, the least colourful there is Maura McCarthy's, even though there's a hell of a lot of stuff on it. But the beautiful colours that are there, and you wouldn't think, again, you wouldn't think that that's in our town, but it is. It's there. I suppose it rains a lot and we don't notice. The brackets, just very quickly, I want to talk about the brackets. The brackets are very identifiable. That's over Jerry Leary's shop front, which is a beautiful shop front in its own right. But the bracket took my attention. This bracket is a very simple one, not the most attractive in my view. It's the Barbers near TP Cotters. But what caught my attention is the wires and all of that. You know, it's I can understand why they're there, but we could take a bit more care when they're laying them out. You know, the service providers don't think about this, but a bit more care when they're laying out, because they will ruin your frontage. You know, that sort of thing will ruin your frontage. The maintenance there is very important. If the lead flashing starts getting damaged by vegetation or anything like that, you'll get water penetration in behind it. It'll start to break it down. So, you know, those things should be watched. I think it's very, very well done there in Larry's. The signage, we're coming to the end now, I promise. The signage, some beautiful signage around the town. We have good tradition in the town of sign writers. And, you know, to be fair to Gerald McCarthy there, quite a bit of investment in the shop front and the sign writing. He's not selling anything. You know, that's not a shop that you're not attracted to go into. If you have business in there, you'll go in there. But, you know, a conscious decision to tie in with the rest of the street, very, very important. You know, credit to the owner of the shop, the building for that. This is an old photograph of Webb Fashion Boutique. That sign there, this is painted on, that's painted on. These are planted on, right? They're cut out shapes of the letters and they're pressed into the fascia. This is in relief. It's carved into the fascia. It's painted and it's covered with a sheet of glass. It's the only example in Macroom. Be very hard pressed to find a good example of it in Cork. And there are one or two examples of it in Clonmel. But that's the only one that I could find in the locality. And to be fair, it's still there. It's changed its name and it's changed its use, but it's still there. And it's worth your while again next time you're down there this evening. Just stop and take a look at that, because there's a plate of glass protecting it. Very common in the bigger shops and the wealthy shops that they put gold paint into the relief of the lettering, and they clamped on the glass. It's a very, very unusual, and it's very important that particular shop front is protected. I could do a whole other lecture on protected structures. I won't bore you with it. The local identity, I tried to find what makes us unique. I've tied it down to a couple of things. Margaret's shop front there, the solicitors, the arches are something that is appearing in a lot of the older shop fronts. Now, I don't know whether it's unique to Macroom, but it seems to be appearing, that little arch there seems to be appearing in a lot of the older shop fronts. The canopy is very much a Macroom thing. And it's hard, I understand, to maintain a canopy. It's a hard thing to do, but it is something that's kind of unique to the town. Other towns in the area they may have one or two, but they don't have many. At one stage, the northern side of the street was all canopies. and some of them are still remaining. I've got Mickey Kelleher's, it's Hartnett's now, but Mickey Kelleher's shop front, it caught my eye. There's now a canopy there as well, which is fabulous. It comes out, I don't know how much sun it's hitting, it's on the south side, but it does get evening sun, there's no doubt about it. Pickled has a canopy. I think it's there to protect their patrons from getting covered in rain, but it's fabulous, and they're using it, and it's there. And lots of the streets. I just have an old photograph there of, and that's a fairly common, well-known photograph, but you can see, that's Mickey Kelleher's there. It's got no shop front in it. That's from the 1950s or 1940s or whatever. This is a later investment, and the brackets in particular caught my eye, So if I'm trying to look at something that identifies us, I'm honing in on the canopies. A quick case study, one of my favourites, no doubt about Twigs. Michael Augustine's, when I was a kid going in there, the smell of rubber and all of that, and he pretty much had everything, and it was all over the floor. That's what I can remember. But they had everything in that shop. Beautiful shop. Recently renovated. Obviously, when the work was being done, they had to get equipment in and out of the place. So they took out that window. They took out that window there. And they probably removed that wall and that sill. And they replaced it. Now, apologies for that photograph. It's in transition period. I know you're... so apologies for the photograph. But when the window was replaced, they decided to continue this arch detail. Now, it wasn't necessary. It was quite nice without it. One of those photographs, that's pickled in its old form. And when they were doing that shop front, they continued that detail. So that they copied that detail down. And I think that's fantastic. Looking forward to a new use on that shop front. It's close to one of the oldest I could find in the town. And it's definitely one of the most interesting. And again, the lettering is just, it was cut out and planted on. It's very simple, very simple. Why is it lasting so long? It's very flush with the wall. It's disappearing to the wall. It's not protruding out from the wall. It's not inviting the water to get in behind it. It's flush with the wall. That's why they're lasting so long. There's something about the cornices I wanted to say, but anyway, that doesn't matter. And I couldn't say anything about shop fronts without talking about Golden's. A Golden's shop front, it's had these different views of it at different periods, but you can't look at the shop front without looking at the building. The building is the shop front, And the good thing about it, that's what I wanted to say about that other one. If I can go back. It's off-centre, there's asymmetry there. There's still the golden proportions all over it, but there's asymmetry there, and there's nothing wrong with that. It makes it unique. Golden's, again, there's the laneway. It's not trying to hide the laneway. It's not introducing it into the shop front. It's all part of it. It's one big scheme. This building was featured in a Cork County Council publication on 8 different buildings in the whole county of special merit, and this building was featured in it. Because it is a fabulous, fabulous building, and personally, this building next to it is complementing it, but that's just a personal opinion. Very quickly coming to the end, the Castle Hotel in its old view. I took that from Facebook. If you hear the person who had it put it up there, I apologise for stealing your photo. And this is one that Kevin O'Brien, 2009, decided to step out here one Sunday morning and take a photograph of the front of the Castle Hotel, which is wonderful. And he showed it to me there last week, and I realised, I know that car. And I zoomed in on it, and it was my father stepping out of the car. But Kevin is full of coincidences. That was of his time, but it lacked scale and proportion. That's why this is better. I don't think there's any debate about it, really. This is better. And it's better because it's got that scale and proportion. It lacked it there. You know, nothing wrong with it, and very effective, but was of its time. Just to finish with the Lawrence collection that I managed to tap into and zoom up on, some of the old shop fronts. This image and this image, I estimate they might be about 20 years apart. It's the same photograph, but there's about 20 years apart. There's a little bit of investment in where Granville's is now. There's a shop front and stuff like that. It wasn't there much to any great extent before that. That's over the bridge and up Castle Street, and you can see a number of shop fronts. It's hard to see it now, and I apologise again. I'm putting all of these on the website, and you'll have a good view of you can have a good look at them. But you can see, you know, individual shop fronts and small windows, small glass, but they're all following that scale and proportion, and that, of course, is the street. Now, I'm finished, but I have one more thing to say, and I shouldn't really finish on a negative note. But that's 120 or 130 years ago. That's yesterday. Now, I don't know about that tent. I don't know what you guys think of it. I don't think it's appropriate there, right? But that's not my biggest problem. My biggest problem are these. We've got concrete barriers in the square. Now, I don't think that's right. Again, apologies to anybody who might own that car. That's the least of the problem there. The car is fine. There's that kind of thing. Now, we have it within our power to say to the council, actually, that's not appropriate. They put him there, assuming they put him there because somebody might hit that with their car. Now, that wouldn't be such a bad day, I'd say. But anyway, whatever. Margaret Lucy told me that their shop front, I'll zoom back on it because it's worth talking about. I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here now, and I realize that was a tailor's shop at one time. Drapery shop. And it had a low sill and a big window to sell its wares, as shop fronts do. And sometime in the 50s or 60s?
20s.
Oh, the 20s, somebody ran into it. Oh, no.
Sorry, somebody ran into it in the 80s.
In the 80s, that's it.
It stopped being a shop in the 1920s.
Yeah.
And then they obviously filled in the window, but they only did it with hardwood.
Yeah.
So what happened in the 80s?
Yeah, what happened in the 80s is somebody drove into it by accident. They put it into first instead of reverse or whatever, and they went into it, right? Now, that obviously the requirement for a solicitor was not a big window, so they raised the sill and they put in glass and all that, right? That's a natural development of a shop front. It hasn't lost its proportions, and for me, it's still quite attractive, right? But they didn't put up a concrete barrier after that person ran into it. Sorry, did I go back too far? They didn't put up a concrete barrier like that after the person ran into it, you know? I don't see why we should have those on our street. You know, we're not under siege. That's to stop Abraham tanks from invading. You know, it's ridiculous. It is absolutely ridiculous. The other point I want to bring to your attention here is we have control over a certain amount of clutter that happens in our streets. You can't appreciate any of those buildings. Now, the grass is not appropriate on the wall. That's one thing. The plastic signs, not appropriate. That's another thing. But they're not game changers. That is absolutely appalling on our street. You know, it wouldn't be a bad thing next time you're passing the council offices to walk in and voice your concerns. People more important than myself might actually have some impact and get the hell out of the way. I don't see progress there. 120 years of progress, I don't see it. So, now, I have a whole bunch of other photographs, and there's a whole lot of other shop fronts that I haven't talked about today. I'll put them on the website, and I'd really enjoy your feedback tonight and going forward as well. Thank you very much.